Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to say that I am back on the channel with Dale from Real Seekers. And so Dale is a person who likes to look into the Shroud of Turin, and he has a nice little slide deck. We're going to discuss some very interesting, rather recent hypotheses about the Shroud of Turin. And we went into it. I think both of us went into it initially when we were investigating the Shroud of Turin with an open mind, saying, let's just go where the evidence leads us. And I think that Dale has gone down the path much farther than I have. I've looked at a lot of evidence, but I haven't looked into as deeply as Dale has. So without further ado, let me go ahead and Dale, can you tell us a little about yourself and how you came to research the Shroud and what we're going to discuss today?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Dale. I'm the host of Real Seekers, as you can see on your screen there. But yeah, so I basically host a podcast, kind of like yours, Stephanie. There, do I call you Stephanie or SJ? I forget.
Either one.
Cool. So yeah, I host a podcast kind of on the philosophy of religion. My trade is philosophy, and specifically with an interest in philosophy of religion. So I bring on experts to debate everything from the existence of God to the evidence for the resurrection. And one of my series is the Shroud Wars series. As you mentioned, I do like to specialize in the evidence for the Shroud of Turin as an argument for Christianity. So yeah, I've been doing that for a few years now, where I'll bring on my Shroud Wars series. I'll bring on various experts like Joe Marino, who I know you're well familiar with, a Shroud skeptic like Hugh Ferry or Bob Rucker and Barry Schwartz, and we get together to discuss various evidences in favor of the Shroud of Turin and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And Barry Schwartz has this amazing channel, shroud.com. If you haven't gone to that, go to that. He was one of the people in the 1980s who did a lot of investigating with the Shroud. He was with the Shroud of Turin Research Group. And obviously Joe Marino has also been on my channel before, and he was on with us before. And so we had a great chance to talk to him. He's very well versed. I'm still on his email list. So he sends people emails about the Shroud and anything that's going on. So probably we might be on there right now, this video. I'm not sure.
It'll be sent out. If not, it'll be sent out by tonight or so. It's insane because he keeps up to date with everything that anyone does in terms of Shroud, YouTube, wherever you post it. I don't know how he does it, but yeah, he's a great resource. So yeah.
Yeah. So what you and I both believe, and then we'll get into the details on how some of the facts that you've looked at. I want to say hi to Susan Slam RN, who's in the chat. She says it's one of her favorite topics, and it's definitely one of mine too. Susan, you're in for a real treat because we're going to talk about some pretty deep hypotheses, the minimal relevant features hypotheses and the Proto-Photo of image forming. And so we're going to look at that. And so without further ado, so the Shroud is, just in case people don't know what the Shroud is, I don't know how that's even possible, but in case they don't know, it's recognized by many as the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And some people have said that there was some dating in the 1980s and 1988 that was the carbon dating that led it back to the medieval times. But since then, quite a bit of research has gone against that. And there's been different hypotheses that have come out about, like, for example, the sampling that was used. It might have been something that was woven in the medieval times, that sort of a thing. And so people have looked today and they found a lot of evidence that's consistent with ancient Near East, like some of the limestone fragments and things like that. And so lots of evidence out there. Nobody knows how the image got on the Shroud. And I think that might be a little bit of what we're diving into today. It looks like a burst of radiation. And of course, if you believe that Jesus is the God-man, he is both God and man. And when he would have died and come back to life, this massive burst of radiation, which is consistent with what they saw on the walls in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, as far as people's bodies appearing on these walls after that blast of radiation. So Dale, tell us about what you have. And if you want to share your slide deck, whenever you're ready to do that, I'm happy to put that on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So obviously I think you did a great general introduction as to what the Shroud is and stuff. And I know that probably most of your audience is already familiar with it. So what I wanted to focus on today, so a lot of shows out there on the Shroud are kind of about the historicity aspect of the Shroud. How do you address carbon dating, the Sudarium of Oviedo, or all of that kind of stuff? And that's great. But I also think that focusing on the question of image formation for me is the most important topic. That's what I kind of wrote my 300-page chapter on the shroud, I didn't even address historicity at all. So there's a lot of fascinating material out there on image formation. And I kind of have a unique approach to doing this. So I call this my minimal relevant features approach. It's kind of similar to Dr. Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach for the resurrection. So let me just share my screen here and bring up that first part.
So while you're doing that, so this is
Yep.
your theory. Is this something that somebody else? So you
I
created this
invented.
yourself?
Yeah. So if it's
Nice.
stupid, I'm to blame. But
Wow. And a 300-page chapter, that's the longest chapter I think I would have ever read. I was like,
oh yeah,
that's
I'm insane. But yeah, and that's all for free on my blog kind of thing at realseekerministries.wordpress.com.
mhm.
Uh, yeah, if you search like 300 pages, it'll pop up. Get it all for free. So yeah.
Wow. That's
All
very
right.
generous. And
No,
thank you, hello, Captive Desk, too. So yeah, let's go.
awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, the MRF approach is what I call the minimal relevant features approach. So kind of like I said, it's similar to the minimal facts approach on the resurrection. I only use certain facts or features that qualify under certain strict criteria. So in the first place, they have to be highly evidenced facts. So these are, you'll see in I'll get to that in a second, actually. So I only use certain facts that are highly evidenced and that we have scholarly consensus. I define that as about 2/3 rather than 95% that Gary does in the field of history. And also only the features that are necessary for the success of my overall argument. So there are those three criteria that I use. And just a bit of a caveat here, because I can picture atheists like Matt Dillahunty saying, yeah, but the problem with these minimal facts approaches are that you engage in selection bias or cherry picking. So included in my minimal relevant features are also certain counter features, which I think have been proven to be probably true, just to avoid any hint of selection bias and that sort of thing. So one thing just to say, so in terms of, okay, well, highly evidenced, what does that mean? And basically, Shroud experts have kind of split up some of the facts pertaining to the Shroud of Turin into various types or classes, right? So I only use what are called type A or B level facts, or what is also known as class 1 level facts. And I'll just show you a glimpse of what that looks like here. So if you see like sort of lists of facts, this is something signed by over 24 Shroud experts and that sort of thing. But you can see, so type A, these are unquestionable facts. Everybody agrees with them. Even Richard Dawkins would agree with it if he knew anything about the Shroud. Type B are also scientifically confirmed observations. They're in the peer-reviewed literature, including primary peer-reviewed literature from directly observing the cloth. But there may be a few scholars who question it or that sort of thing. So those are the only facts that I use in my approach. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell what the minimal relevant features approach is. Any questions on just what the approach is in general so far, Stephanie? Or
No, I think you've laid that out quite clearly. Carry on.
all right, sounds good. Okay, so the next question is, well, what are some of these minimal relevant features that I use? And obviously, I'm not going to include all of them, but I've highlighted about 7 of them that I think are relevant for the hypothesis we're going to be looking at today. So the first is the body image. It has a high resolution, and it's actually been quantified. No idea what that means, but it's a very high resolution image. You can see the lips, for example. And the resolution of the bloodstains are even better, about 10 times better. So, and you can see very fine scratches with ultraviolet illumination. So that's the first feature. Then there's body image uniformity. And there are actually different types of uniformity. So there's body image uniform intensity of color. And that's the one I'm using here, where each individual fibril is colored uniformly and individually. So it's not like, where you have areas that are darker than others. It's not because, oh, well, one fibril is colored darker than the other. No, it's only based on the concentration of the number of fibrils that are all colored exactly exactly the same. So that's what body image uniform intensity is there. Then there's the 3D aspect, which everybody knows. Basically, that's based on the image density. It provides topographic information, right? So the closer the tip of the nose is darker than the sides of the cheek. And that's what allows us to stick that into a VP8 image analyzer and see that, yeah, it corresponds to 3D images or contains topographical information. The next one, this one's not really well known, but I think this is one of the most important ones, is the fact that, okay, so not only are the body images full length, there are no gaps or anything like that, apart from the body sides that are missing, but we know that whatever formed that image had to be vertically collimated, right? So these things were the images were vertically mapped onto the cloth. And I have I think a helpful visual image here just to show you what I'm talking about with that. So here's the VP8 that would give you the 3D. And here's what I'm talking about with the vertically mapped. So the Shroud of Turin, this is the tip of the nose of Jesus, and here's the cloth kind of covering the face. We know that what formed the image followed path P, a straight line vertical encodation path, right? So this is what it means, what we're talking about here. It wasn't, if you had path A, that would be like direct contact where you press the cloth to the nose and it absorbs the image onto the cloth. Well, that would be path A. Emissions would be for gas emissions. If gas just came out and formed the images, then it would follow path E. So I hope is that clear, Stephanie, in terms of what this feature is?
Yes, I didn't realize I was on mute. Yes, it's very clear.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So yeah, because that's the most technical one. So bear in mind that vertically mapped thing is going to be important. Okay, so back to that. We also have body image superficiality. And there are at least 3 levels of superficiality. I've included the 2 most important here. So it's number 1, it's the fact that on a thread level, each individual thread is made up of about 200 to 300 fibrils. 200 fibrils. But the shroud body image color is only on the top 2 to 3 of those fibers. It doesn't extend below that, which is pretty superficial. And also at the fiber level, it's only on the color is only on the outer surface of the primary cell wall. And it only goes, this thick. Again, that is incredible. It doesn't penetrate even an individual fibril, which has the diameter of a human hair. It is extremely small and thin. Okay, and then 2 more minimal relevant features that are relevant here. So the other one regarding the blood stains, a lot of people miss out on the features or properties of the blood stains, which I think are also important. So in the first place, there are things like that. There's no body images underneath the bloodstains themselves. They terminate precisely at the boundaries of the bloodstains or those serum retraction rings. And this is why a lot of shroud experts posit that, well, the bloodstains must have been formed first. They got onto the cloth first somehow, and that kind of blocked whatever mechanism was used to form the body images. So this is an interesting fact as well. And then obviously is under additional features here, there's no silver or photo sensitizing solutions or emulsions that are detectable in the image areas of the shroud. So those are the facts that we're going to be working with to evaluate the Proto-Photo hypothesis. But but before I move on.
So it's interesting. So just kind of to summarize a couple of the things that you said that you were touching on, you kind of emphasized the fact that the image that appeared on the shroud could appear to something the size of a hair. So it's kind of like a photograph rather than saying it was a painting or something that would have somehow leaked in deeper into the shroud. So it's truly like a photograph image. And the other thing that you said, you talked a little bit about the blood. And so that, of course, did penetrate a little bit into the shroud.
Absolutely. Yeah. The bloodstains we know were put onto the shroud in a liquid state because they penetrate right through to the other side of the cloth, right? If you look at the others, flip it over and look at the other side, you'll see the bloodstains penetrating through the cloth. So, yep, absolutely right.
I want to say hi to people in the chat too. We have other people came in here. So we got Captive Death, Slam RN, Joe Marino is here. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Joe.
Kevin, non-traditional Catholic, and Nitty. And so welcome everybody. I can see I've got a diversity of views. So please be kind in the chat with each other. That's all I want to say.
Hopefully they're not insulting me. I didn't do that bad. Come on, guys.
Oh, no, they're not insulting. They're just talking about this. There's a couple people, it doesn't seem like they think the shroud is authentic.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. They're welcome here as well. So, all right, cool. Well, yeah. Do you want me to kind of move on to the
Sure.
hypothesis? Okay. All right, cool. So, okay. So I wanted to give you guys an example. Well, how do I apply this minimal relevant features approach, right? So how would it apply to an actual hypothesis that some of the shroud skeptics might offer as to how the images got formed? And I wanted to just kind of focus in on one of them for today, and that's the Proto-Photo hypothesis. So what is this theory? Basically, it's the hypothesis that fits into one of three types of mechanism under what I call the sunlight-based mechanisms, right? So under the sunlight-based mechanisms, there are things like the shadow method or the solar reflex model, but the most prominent or famous of this category is these Proto-Photo type methods. And basically, this kind of theorizes that, well, the images are actually primitive medieval literal photographs that could have been formed by placing a standing body statue in the sunlight directly across from a linen cloth. And obviously that cloth would have had to have been coated in some kind of photosensitive solution of one sort, because the cloth is acting like a film kind of thing in a camera. And then you put that in the wall in a dark room, and then using a lens that's put right in the middle between the body and the cloth, well, sunlight goes through that and it forms images on the cloth. And this is a technique known in history as the camera obscura technique. Okay, and I have a couple of images to show you guys what we're talking about. But just before we get into that, so understand this theory was popular in the 1990s, really. And there's been actually two major attempts to reproduce this using Proto-Photo methods. The first is by people like Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. And their method has been utterly refuted, even by Nicholas Allen himself, who's the other proponent of the Proto-Photo hypothesis. But they get into sort of conspiracy theories saying, oh, well, the shroud was made by Leonardo da Vinci, even though he was born 100 years after the 1350s, when we know the shroud was there, right? So yeah, that Nicholas Allen is really where it's at. If you want the most credible version of the Proto-Photo, you're going to look at Nicholas Allen's work. So let me just show a couple visual images to help you understand, right? So here's how Nicholas Allen's method works. So here's the shroud cloth in a dark room. This is where the lens would be, or the little hole. And then you either have a dead body, or a statue is what Nicholas Allen used hanging up. And the sun will reflect off that and then go through the lens, and it'll create the images on the cloth. Does that make sense so far in terms of how it works, Stephanie? Or
Yeah. So these are people's arguments against the authenticity of the shroud, essentially, right?
Well, so this is a shroud skeptic who, this is his attempt to try and explain, how did these images get on the shroud?
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks it's some medieval artist set this contraption up, and he invented the world's first photograph kind of thing.
Now, photography wasn't invented until much later, as far as we know. And I remember, if I recall correctly, it was in the late 1800s who initially took the picture of the shroud and was amazed at what he found.
Yeah. That was Secondo Pia in 1898 there. So that's obviously one of the main criticisms, as we'll see when I get into the plausibility, is, look, photography. So some medieval genius invented photography in the 1350s, and then it became lost to history for 500 years until someone rediscovered it, type thing. So that's one of the criticisms against it. But all right, this theory is, just before I get into any evaluation, any questions? Was that Was that clear? Do you think you get it? Or
No, I think when you put the cumulative evidence together for the shroud, and you say he's saying the image appeared this way, but then you've got to account for the blood stains and the way that the crown was on his head, and the way that he's got blood right here and here, and of course on very consistent with the biblical account of how he was whipped, and also consistent with Isaiah 52 and 53 with the whole crucifixion account, and how that was described with how bloody and unrecognizable Jesus had become. I think that it seems like extreme to try to say that somebody in the medieval times was able to put this all together without having the further technology that they had 1898 with that one photographer.
absolutely, yep. And you just stole my thunder. That's basically what I'm going to say in my assessment here, in my evaluation using the minimal relevant features approach. Going over, if you remember those 7 features I kind of highlighted to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of high resolution, here's the results that Nicholas Allen got on the left. And this is the Shroud of Turin on the right. Let me just maximize that so you can see that better. So in the first place, in terms of high resolution images, look at this. This is actually one of the cases where it's superior to the Shroud of Turin. So it doesn't account for the resolution of the Shroud of Turin images, because if the medieval artists used this proto-photo method, it would produce images that are too good. They're even more highly resolved than we have with the Shroud of Turin. So that's one way that we can rule out that this technique was used, right? Next, in terms of body image uniformity, it can't explain the uniform intensity of color, right? Each individual fibril on the shroud is colored precisely the exact same. But look at Nicholas Allen's results. You've got little black gaps here, and you've got, look at the feet here, white spots all over it. This is not uniform intensity of color. And Stirp photographer Barry Schwartz kind of notes these shadowing effects and also these bright spots, which is basically where from the sun, right? The angle of the sun causing these things. So it utterly fails on this front. In terms of the 3D images, once again, these have been tested in VP8 image analyzers, and these methods inherently employ frontal illumination, right? The sun bounces off the body out in the sun and goes through the lens and then onto the cloth in the room. We know scientifically that is just unable to reproduce the subtle lights and darks that are needed to create the topographic information as read by the VP8 image analyzer. So it can't produce 3D images. Also think about it. Remember that encodation path P, where it's got to be vertically encolumnated. Well, this technique by definition would not create vertically mapped wrapping distortions, right? So yeah, basically experts have said, quote unquote, no geometrical interaction between the cloth and a body would be translated into the wrapping distortion information.
I just thought of something too that would be unbelievable here. Now we have to remember that Jesus was in a cave. I guess this postulation is the interesting thing about how the shroud appears. Is his whole theory is that an imposter put this thing together, but did he do a backside?
He did, but that has to be done separately. So yeah, that's I didn't include this in my assessment, but in my 300-page chapter, that causes a lot of problems because he had to do the dorsal side separately from the frontal, and lining things up like that would be impossible for any human to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, cool. So in terms of body image superficiality, we also have a failure here, because remember that the shroud in this, let me go back to the image just to remind you guys, right? The shroud here is acting like film. So it's got to be soaked in an emulsion that makes it photosensitive to the light in order to create the images, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that would mean that we would have evidence of this. So Nicholas Allen thinks that that's something involving silver nitrate solution, or there's another silver solution that he posits. Well, that means you wouldn't have superficiality, because this light-sensitive emulsion would have coated the entire cloth of the shroud and penetrated way beyond the first few layers of the shroud type deal, right?
But it didn't, though, right? There's no silver in the shroud.
Yeah, well, that's yeah, exactly. So that's my minimal relevant feature number 7. But so yeah, you're ahead of me. That's going to be another major blow
Hmm.
to this guy's theory, right? So yeah, and also in terms of no body images underneath the blood stains, well, the use of photosensitizers would likely have caused major damage or alteration to the blood stains if the blood stains were put on the shroud first. Again, imagine an artist painting on bloodstains, realistic bloodstains, without the reference of any body, but somehow he manages to do it. And then all of a sudden sets up this photo process to encode the body images. Um, well, that would have caused damage and noticeable alteration to the bloodstains.
Hmm.
Now, if he did it the other way around and encoded the body images first using this technique and then added the blood with a paintbrush afterwards or something, well, then there would be body images underneath the bloodstains. The bloodstains wouldn't erase the body images formed through the sunlight. So that's a failure on this method here.
Hmm.
And, yeah, and lastly, as you mentioned, there's no silver on the shroud, and there should be so Nicholas Allen is aware of this, and he'll provide the retort, oh well, it was washed off afterwards, right? Yeah, but you can't, in order to have the body images in the first place, the silver that is responsible for the body images would have been fixed to the cloth during a fixing process, which Nicholas Allen posits was urine. There's a chemical in the urine that can fix these images. Okay, well, that means that this washing would only remove the unused portion of the silver. In the body images, we should still detect silver if this is what they use, type deal. So it's an utter failure
Hmm.
on this front.
Yeah, and Kevin, not non-traditional, is asking a question. He says, "What does Dale make of the problematic proportions of the shroud figure? The difference between the arms, the incorrectly sized head, the disproportionate hip placement? Have you looked into any of those arguments or ideas?"
Yeah. So believe it or not, this Saturday I'm doing a show with actual experts to talk about the historical authenticity in terms of the historical Jesus, and also the anatomical accuracies and inaccuracies with Mark Antonacci and Mark Neer and Hugh Ferry. So we're going to be going over this, but yeah, so there are various explanations in terms of there are minor anatomical inaccuracies that even Stirp mentioned, and there are various explanations as to these. So not, and they could provide a cumulative effect. So in the first place, the treatment of the cloth itself, was it stretched over the centuries? This can provide alterations, right? When you're looking at, and especially if you're looking at a photo versus, what was the parameters of the photo, where was the camera in relation to the shroud and stuff like that. So these differences do make a difference. Also, in terms of how the images were formed, this also plays a fact, right? So, for example, you'll see evidence of tenting where one of the legs is thinner than the other. Well, how did that come? It's based on the position of the body. The cloth was further away from the body at that time, and that creates some sorts of distortions and that sort of thing. In terms of the fingers, well, this is just a kind of an illusion because they're kind of curved a bit. And if you do this with a measuring tape, it's readily explainable. The fingers are not too long. That's just an illusion that it looks like to us.
Well, it's because the way the bones are in the hand. So if you look at your finger bones, I've heard that's why you see the fingers that look kind of long, is because we're seeing into the palm of the hand, the bones in there.
That's another explanation. Yeah, I don't believe that myself, but yeah, people like Gary Habermas have claimed that's another explanation, right? Is, oh well, we're seeing the bones because somehow X-rays were involved, type deal, right? Mm-hmm. So, yep. And as for the arm, it's not too long. It actually does work. Again, there's some disruption here, kind of thing. So, yeah, anatomical experts have actually studied this using computers and have found that, by and large, taking into effect that we don't know how the images were formed and certain conditions like the tenting effect or how the cloth has been treated through the centuries, this is anatomically perfect in terms of the Shroud Man, and it's been studied by forensic computers in forensic setting, and I'll link to the paper there.
Yeah, I saw in fact, in the video that I have here, one of the things that I has the photo on the thumbnail is the picture that someone had recreated of the full body image, and it looks completely anatomically correct.
Yep, exactly. And beyond the computer analysis, I mean, think about it. Over 24 medical and forensic experts from all persuasions, not just Christians or pro-Shroud people, but atheists and agnostics as well, from the last 100 years, have all said that, yeah, this guy is anatomically correct. So a medieval artist trying to fool someone like that would be highly unlikely, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the next element then is I use the best explanation inference criteria to kind of judge overall, right? Plausibility, explanatory scope, explanatory power, and then simplicity or less ad hoc. So in terms of plausibility, you can see that the proto-photo hypothesis is very implausible. Number one, there are no known examples of this method in artistic history apart from the Shroud. And the fact that photography was invented and then not passed down at all, and we just lost it for 500 years, that's implausible. Also, it's very implausible that he could have utilized the lens, because the specific type of lens that he needs, in the first place, camera obscura methods didn't utilize lenses until the 1550s. That's what we know historically. That's 200 years after even the skeptics admit the Shroud was around. And basically all such methods, they entail using technology and techniques that were not available until the 19th century. And with that lens, specifically, it had to have specific dimensions. It had to be formed by heating quartz to about 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. We human beings didn't have the technology to do that until the Industrial Revolution. It is historically impossible that the lens required for this method to work existed at that time. And you can see there are other issues. And then finally, even Allen admits that the only plausible solutions for a photosensitizing agent have to pertain to either silver nitrate or silver sulfate. So that was the other one. But he couldn't find any documentation to prove that such a solution existed in the medieval period. The only thing they had was silver chloride at that time, and that's completely useless in terms of acting as a photosensitizing agent. So yeah, as you can see, this method is very implausible. Mm-hmm. Very quickly, in terms of explanatory scope, obviously you've seen it. It lacks explanatory scope because it can't account for multiple minimal relevant features. And it can't create so this is going back to what you mentioned, Stephanie, it can't create the entire image without requiring multiple attempts to be perfectly fitted together. So for example, he has to do the frontal first, then he has to turn the body around and do the same process to get the dorsal image. He also couldn't do the face at the same time because there would be distortions that would do. So he had to do the face separately. And then somehow he cobbles this all together into one shroud cloth that perfectly fits. I don't think that's plausible to believe either. And like I said, it lacks explanatory power because it fails on at least those 7 features that I mentioned. And then finally, in terms of simplicity, so just a couple of quotes, because Nicholas Allen, he kind of tries to find scraps in the historical record, right? Like, oh, well, there was a camera obscura that existed where they had a hole and they could use it for stuff. Okay, but that's not a modern photograph kind of thing in the medieval period. And he's trying to, some people had some kinds of lenses or crystals that existed in the medieval period. Okay, who cares? That's not a lens that's needed to make proto-photo methods. So basically, I just have a couple of quotes here, but probably the one from Freeman Dyson is the most apt, right? Look, even if all the materials needed to make spacecrafts capable of leaving our galaxy is all around us today on Earth, that doesn't mean that a student living 1,000 years from now would be any less foolish in concluding that we can actually make such vessels in the 20th century. And this is what I think Allen's doing. He's cobbling together these little elements. Well, we have a camera obscura method, but there was crystals and stuff like that could have been used to focus sunlight. Yeah, but that doesn't combined to saying, well, in the medieval period, they could actually make a modern photographic machine type thing and make a modern photograph. That's just outside of the possibility of the medieval period. So with that said, I will shut up because I've been talking way too long. So yeah, that's
no, I think it's really good. I was kind of keeping my eye over there looking at the chat, but I've seen various images, and Kevin, I don't as far as the 3D image, I wanted to ask you about, have you seen the 3D image that was generated? There was one that was put together by a person. I don't think that one was computerized. I think it was based on a computer image, but then it is actually put together in a figure, like a hard figure, which was white. And I think that was done in Italy. And then there was other ones that have been put together. Have you looked at any of those sorts of things where they've tried to recreate this whole body?
yeah, absolutely. I think I think Giulio Fonte is involved in that and stuff as well, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Like I said, it is anatomically correct, and like I said, various forensic experts have studied that as well. We've done that computer assessment, that anthropomorphic study that has proven that as well. That's not to deny that there are minor little disturbances, but that's based on various factors, based on the position of the cloth, based on how the images were formed, which right now we don't know, right? And as well, how the body was at the time of image formation, stuff like that can account for those things.
Yeah, I think the shroud is really fascinating, and I think that if you give it an honest look and with an open mind, I think you will come to the conclusion that it's authentic. No, I mean, if the very reason that we have no idea how this image was put on there, even the best hypothesis, the Proto-Photo hypothesis that someone has come up with, doesn't explain all of the aspects of the shroud at all. It's missing quite a few things, and little things about the shroud, that's its consistency with the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is dated way before the shroud, and that was Jesus' sweat cloth. And as I mentioned before we started, Otangelo made a really good video that now has 273,000 people watching it. And it basically, he did the consistency with taking the Sudarium and aligning it with the face on the shroud and noticing how the blood patterns and all of the stains were very, very similar. And so that's also, I think that's very compelling.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like I said, the last time I was on your show, we were kind of discussing my debate with the atheist Jordan, I forget his last name now, but from Reason to Doubt. And my positive case was based on the forensic link of the Sudarium of Oviedo. So not only have forensic experts proven that there's a sufficient degree of correspondence in terms of the blood flows and body fluids on those two cloths, there's also been a 2016 morphological study that links the origin points of the blood flows are in the same place for both people that the cloths covered. And there's also what Cesar Barta mentions, that half blood stain, where on one of the cloths, it's like a donut. There's a hole in the middle in terms of the blood stain. And then the corresponding matching hole of blood is on the other cloth, linking these two things. So yeah, I think this is great evidence.
Yeah, and I think that that's among the evidence. There's a lot of other evidence that links it back to the first century. The other interesting thing is the cloth itself is such high quality, and the Sudarium of Oviedo was just more of a lower quality cloth. But the high quality is consistent with the story that he was buried by a rich man who had purchased really very good linen. And even the absence of cotton in the linen, because cotton would have been more prevalent in the medieval times than, say, in the ancient Near East.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's definitely remarkable in terms of the shroud's quality, right? Its pliability and flexibility. It is literally remarkable in the literal sense. And various scholars and textile experts have commented on this. And it's in a way, I could argue that's actually evidence for some sort of radiation being used that would have affected the linen and preserved it. That's not proven. There could be there are various natural contributions that people have survived based on, how has the cloth been treated over the centuries and stuff like that as to why it's preserved. But yeah, it's basically like a t-shirt is the feel. That basically it's unique compared to all other textiles from antiquity, which are far more brittle, far more degraded.
Yeah. And have you ever been to the Shroud of Turin? Have you been able to go visit and see it?
I have not. No.
Is that on your bucket list?
You know what? It's not, because I don't know why. Like so I'm Protestant and that sort of thing. Maybe that's why. Like I don't have an urge to see it. For me, it's all about the data from it, and the fact that we can prove a miracle that these are miraculously formed image. That's the main important thing for
Mm-hmm.
me. But yeah, if I'm given an opportunity, I'll take it and say like that's cool. But it's not like a bucket list thing for me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's really a fascinating study. And I think that now Joe Marino is in the chat. He's been investigating, like we mentioned, for a very long time. He's been highly involved in this. The man knows every single study on the shroud, keeps up with all of it. And so he's been very active in the chat here, responding to people who might not be as believing in its authenticity. So I want to say I appreciate that, Joe.
Awesome. Is he all by himself? He doesn't have any backup or?
Oh no, he's got well, Susan is in the chat too. And who else did I see there? I've got a Captive Desk Nitty. I just saw another person. Shiami. Hi Shiami. I forgot to say hi to you too. So welcome. Wonderful to see all of you.
Yeah.
And also the other thing that I forgot to mention that was present from the ancient Near East is they looked at ancient pollen and they looked at the oils. And a lot of times when people were buried, they were buried with these particular oils. And we can recall that from the story from the Gospels that Jesus also had been anointed and buried and the best perfume had been used on him and all of this kind of stuff. And so a lot of that kind of evidence coming from ancient Israel is also evidenced on the shroud. And so again, taking it away from the dating that goes much later into, say, France in the medieval times.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's something that I also in my debate on the Siderium of Oviedo, I think, right, where they found these pollen grains that are specific to types of plants that were only used up to a certain period in the Roman Empire for funeral ointments and stuff. I think up to the 2nd century after the great crisis of the Roman Empire. So that's a way of dating the Siderium of Oviedo earlier than just the 600 or 500s AD. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if the shroud is linked to the Siderium, that places the shroud further back as well.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And I mean, this is one of those things that you don't have to believe in it to increase your faith. But I would like more Christians to look into the Shroud of Turin if they haven't taken a really honest look into it yet. You can access university libraries that have lots of information and recent studies. And a lot of studies have discounted the 1988 carbon dating for good reasons. One of them relates to what Joe discovered with this little piece of the shroud being taken out, and maybe it was woven in later. Other studies have looked at other aspects, but one of the big problems with the 3 different labs was that it was very heterogeneous as far as the content of what they analyzed. And so the dates were very heterogeneous. And so there's been many criticisms of the 1988. And unfortunately, the church has not allowed people to go in and grab more of the shroud, probably for good reasons. When you go in there, and they're afraid that some wonderful relic that we have could be tampered and maybe possibly altered or ruined in some way.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I do think that there are other motivations as well, which are less noble in terms of the Catholic Church not allowing the testing and stuff. But yeah, like from what I know from Barry, like definitely the people in Turin, they are on board. They want to test this thing. They want more testing and stuff. But yeah, one thing I can just show in terms of the image formation, I forgot to show this, but just. It's on my blog where I have my 300-page document, and maybe I'll send Stephanie the link. But so you can see, so this is the sunlight-based things. I've got all of the minimal relevant features down the left-hand side. And then I've assessed, right? So here's the Proto-Photo method. You know, all the red things are where it fails. There's the shadow hypothesis, my evaluation of that. So like, this is kind of a helpful visual way of assessing all of the theories and where they fail or where they succeed. So,
yeah, that is
awesome. Yeah, I'll send you the link and maybe you can post it up in the YouTube video description or something.
Yeah, good idea. I like that. So, and actually, you know what? I should get a link to your book. You mentioned your blog and that kind of thing, so I can put that in the description too, so people can click on that and read that 300 pages of delicious text.
Hopefully, yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely do that.
So is there anything else that we should be talking about with respect to the shroud? Anything, any other little tidbits or studies that you've looked at? Is there another counter argument that's really compelling for you besides the Proto-Photo?
Well, so
I mean, the most compelling was the Proto-Photo. I guess it all goes downhill from there. Is that, is that
well, no. So I don't think the Proto-Photo is one of the best, believe it or
Mm.
not. So yeah, I think that in terms of naturalistic mechanisms, like against the supernaturalists, the best that I was aware of was an electrostatic mechanism, which isn't artistic, but it's a natural one involving a dead body, and statics were involved by Dan Spicer and E.T. Totten, called the electric charge separation mechanism. And maybe in a future show, since we're doing a series, I'll get to those. But for right now, I'm just focusing on the artistic ones. And on that front, I guess the best of the artistic, I don't know. I'm going to hold off, but because I want to say like a scorch is probably the best, but by saying that, even those are quite horrible. So
Yeah, and the scorch wouldn't see. One of the things that you pointed out up front was the idea that the way that the image is on the shroud does not penetrate. If it was scorched, it would have more penetration, I would think, on the fibers.
Yeah, and obviously it depends on what type of scorch. Is it a light scorch or a very light scorch versus a thing like that? But I think that the issue of superficiality is always an issue for every scorch method, including. So I think the best of the scorch is by a guy named Colin Berry, who finished his research in 2020. He has what's called the toastograph hypothesis that, again, I'll evaluate at a later point. But yeah, even his method comes the closest, but it still fails superficiality, I'd say.
Yeah, and so the other thing too is the type of blood, which is kind of interesting. So it's an AB type of blood, and that's also consistent with the Sodarium of Oviedo. And it's also common, I guess it's a pretty common blood among Jewish people, and it's less common among other people. And so that's another thing that is interesting. Although my mom has AB, my mom was AB blood, so she's not Jewish, but she somehow acquired that blood. It's like,
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to disappoint you though. I'm a little bit skeptical of that claim kind of thing. I think, in the first place, there is a question about whether degraded blood over the centuries will all turn out as AB and stuff like that. So I think that there's reason to be a little bit hesitant in using that kind of thing, right? That claim at least. So
interesting.
sorry
No, that doesn't disappoint me. It's interesting if that actually is the truth. The other thing was the presence of the bilirubin in the blood too, because it was consistent with a person who'd been beaten quite severely. And so that would also speak against the person who's supposedly going to be making up a fake over in the medieval times, because what's he going to go find a person who just happened to be crucified, has all of the marks of a crucifixion, and severely beaten in the medieval times, or to be able to recreate that with all the blood patches and everything else. And in medieval times, they thought that you were crucified here, the art looks like that, but the crucifixion turns out it's really right here. And we can see that in the, I mean, there's just so many things. When you pile them all up, it's like a massive dog pile against any sort of arguments.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. The cumulative effect has to be taken into account, right? Like obviously my assessment, I was kind of breaking it up to the individual factors, but when you do that cumulative case assessment and put everything together, it's just overwhelming that at least the Proto-Photo theory, which is what we looked at today, I don't think you can. I think it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt that theory is false. I don't think you're a reasonable person if you believe that it's true, kind of thing. But so
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question, if it's okay, if you don't mind me.
Oh, sure.
Tables. I've noticed a lot with your videos. You kind of focus a lot on the historical aspect, right? So is the shroud historically authentic? Have you done a lot of research into the image formation question at all? Or
I haven't. That's why I'm glad I had you on, because you're taking a look at that. All I've seen is people positing that it's some sort of radiation. And I saw that it was kind of consistent with what we saw in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, as far as how those images, because I had images of that, which was really interesting. When the atomic bombs went off there, you'd see images of people's bodies on like walls, but it wasn't 3D images. It wasn't anything quite like the shroud, but it was still kind of similar. So you see just this idea of this sort of radiation. And if you think of Jesus Christ, like I said before, as God and man, of course you can see the light. I mean, he is the light. And so it's consistent with the image of the light bursts. And I think it's absolutely beautiful, and just one of those things that even helps to strengthen our faith.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, I'm a proponent of the radiation hypotheses, or at least certain versions of them. I like the charged particles idea, particle radiation, more so than like ultraviolet and stuff. But I'm open. There's other people like Giulio Fonte who don't go for radiation, but they still advance supernatural mechanisms. So I think his latest is the divine photograph hypothesis. So it's kind of related to the Proto-Photo, but he's got like a supernatural thing where, what are the shroud images? They are literally supernatural divine photographs that God took at the moment of the resurrection. So yeah, there's various options to evaluate and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're going back now, have you, just out of curiosity, have you always been a Christian? Have you just come to the Christian faith, or how did you go about developing an interest in the shroud and Christianity even before that?
Yeah, so I grew up a Christian kind of thing until I guess around 2009, 2010, around there. And I lost my faith at that point. And so at that point, I kind of became an agnostic for 6 months. But I realized that that wasn't true. I really was a theist. But I remained a general theist that didn't believe in Christianity for the next 8 years. And I kind of went on a religious quest to evaluate the evidences for and against the various religions. I was lucky enough to be friends with like Gary Habermas and Tony Costa and all these great guys who kind of helped me during that process. And obviously it was through Gary that I learned about the shroud. Before that, I just dismissed it as a Catholic relic. But when Gary, a Protestant, actually taking this seriously, and as one that I respect as a scholar, so that's where I kind of looked into it and realized, holy cow, there's a lot more to this kind of thing. So yeah, it was 2018 is when May 5th, 2018 is when I came back to faith. I plugged in all the positive and negative evidences into Bayes' theorem and came out with 53.14% probability.
You did not. That's what Cameron Bertuzzi did, Bayes' theorem.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
I did
my
it
gosh.
First. Cameron copied me. If you don't believe me, ask Justin Brierley. It was unbelievable.
Seriously? So he did. That is so funny. That is so funny. That's just not what I did to come back to Christianity. But I think it's funny that obviously, because actually what that shows, and even with your slides, it shows that you're very meticulous. And so you're just going by step. You're saying, okay, I'm going to look at this evidence. I don't care if you look at this one. Maybe I doubt this one. This one I'm not totally sold by. I'll give this one an 80% probability. This one. Exactly. And so you're putting it all together. And I like that last chart that you did, kind of shows us all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'm very systematic and stuff like that. And in my approach, I wanted to come up with a proper way to evaluate the various religions and stuff. So Bayes' theorem gave me a helpful way to put all of the individual pieces together to make, what is that cumulative, what does this mean overall kind of thing, right? So yeah, it was great.
Yeah. No, I had kind of a similar thing. I was never agnostic. I always knew God existed. I don't even think it's coherent for me to think that God doesn't exist. I can't look out the window. I know the atheists will go nuts when I say this, but when I look out the window and I see the trees, I'm just saying this because it's true. I cannot look out at nature and think that there's not a creator, because it's just so darn beautiful. And it's everything that the Bible says that's going to happen. There was a beginning, and we're in a system of decay. And you can see that also in nature. Nature decays, we decay, but that we're going to eventually be put into this other beautiful New Jerusalem where we won't see any more decay. And
I totally agree. So if you had said that thing you said about the tree, obviously it's a cliche, right? But, oh, you're an idiot. I think it's because atheists think that you're making this design inference. You're making an objective argument for design when you say that, but we're not. I think what Christians are really doing, they are grounded in the experience of seeing a tree or a beautiful music or sunset, whatever the experience is. This induces within us a properly basic belief that God exists. So it's not an argument, right? It's this properly basic belief that, because that's how God has designed us to respond to certain experiences and stuff like that. So Yeah, I would have made fun of you years ago if you said, "Well, look at a tree, therefore God." But I was the dummy because there is no therefore. You're not making an argument. It's just immediate. You experience this thing and you know God exists.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. You just and it's wonderful to know God exists, and it's wonderful to know that there is a Father looking down on us and caring very much about us, and with so much more love than we could possibly ever even imagine. So I just think it's tremendous. And yeah, so I want to. Do you want to address Captive Death says no one mentions the shroud's existence till the 1300s. Not a single writing by any early church. Well, of course, it was mentioned in the Gospel of John.
Oh well, yeah, there you go. I think he's probably talking about like shroud images and stuff, but yeah, I mean the shroud is mentioned in the Gospel of John, right? But yeah, so look, this is kind of an assumption kind of thing. There have been various historians and scholars that I've had on my show that do argue. Number one, we have various things. So the Sudarium of Oviedo that does, in my opinion, prove on a balance of probabilities. If you want my number, I think it was about 72 something percent that the shroud is linked to the Sudarium of Oviedo. So if that's true, then we know at the very worst case, it's centuries. It goes back to the 6th century or earlier. So that's proven. There's links to the Hungarian Prayer Codex and stuff like that.
Yeah, plus a lot of the art that shows what Jesus looked like is very consistent with what the man in the shroud looks like.
Exactly. Yeah, there are these other dating techniques that link the certain features of the shroud man's face to coins. I think that's the best one. Giulio Fante's statistical argument, where he is proven there's a 1 chance out of 7 billion or something like that probability that the person who made those coins didn't see the shroud. That means it's extremely likely that he must have seen the shroud in order to create those Justinian coins. So that's a good argument, as well as Giulio Fante's new dating techniques, which cumulatively place the shroud in the 1st century with a 95% degree of confidence, just like, that's what's needed statistically. So yeah. We have lots of evidence that places the shroud before the medieval period.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you've brought up a lot of it today, and I think we've had a very good conversation. And as you mentioned, we're going to have a series. This is what we're going to do. We're going to keep talking more about the shroud, digging into the shroud. We're going to look at the meticulous approaches that Dale's been using. So,
minimal relevant features, Stephanie. Come on, get it right.
yeah, exactly. Minimal relevant features, exactly. So is there anything else that we should talk about before we close? I know we're coming up on an hour or so.
In terms of today's topic on the Proto-Photo, I think we kind of covered everything there. I did have a little bit about the shadow hypothesis, but I've decided it probably best not to go there, just not to distract. But
so we can do that maybe the next time we get together.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
chat about that. So yeah, so we're doing a series. I'm going to create a page where I have all the shroud stuff. If I don't have that in there yet, I think I don't have that in there. So I'm going to get that going. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's come into the chat. And so just keep an open mind when you look out at the shroud. That's what I did. I didn't believe in the shroud for many, many years because I saw what was in 1988. I was around then. So I also was doubting it. But I think if you have an open mind, and same thing with God, if you have an open mind to the possibility that there could be a higher power and a higher love, investigate, take the time, dig deeply, and look into Jesus Christ and his resurrection, because I didn't do that until relatively recently, sadly enough.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that God will reveal himself sooner or later to any and all real seekers and that sort of thing, right? So just look, it took me 8 years kind of thing, but I kept at it and kept being open-minded and looking at the evidence and stuff, and God did it. Here I am. So
I think Kevin's singing in the chat, "Bring me a higher love." That's one song. So funny. So yeah, thank you everybody. Please go, if you haven't yet, go to Dale's channel. I have a link in the description. I'm going to put his blog. He's going to send me his blog, and I'm going to put that also in the description. Make sure that you go to his channel and subscribe to his channel. And if you want to catch what he's got going on this weekend, you want to just repeat that in case anyone just joined us. Hi, Jamie Russell. So I want to repeat that on you're doing something this weekend on the shroud.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, I've got 5 shows this week, so this is why I'm
Oh,
kind of
wow.
frazzled. But yeah, so in terms of the Shroud on Saturday the 29th, either at 11 a.m. or 1 p.m. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but on Real Seekers you'll see it as a live thing. So whatever that says, I'm bringing on pro shroud expert Mark Antonacci and also Mark Neer and shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry to debate 2 topics. Number one, can we link the shroud to the historical Jesus? Is it actually historically accurate to the first century Jewish context or not? As well as kind of what we brought up here in the comments about anatomical accuracies versus inaccuracies. And we're going to be going into a lot of detail on that. And hang on, I'll
Great.
just, in the chat, I'll just post up the link to where I'm in my, oh, there's no way for me to do that. Okay, never mind.
If I see you in the chat, I can give you a mod if you want to post the link in the chat.
I'll just, yeah, I'll put it in the private chat, and I was just going to put it in the live chat for anyone, because this has got my Excel file and the 300-page thing for totally for free for everyone.
Okay, cool. Let me just get that copy link address, and we will put that in the comments.
Awesome.
Here we go. Okay, there. So wonderful. I think it's going in there. So everybody, just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. So thank you so much for coming in, Dale.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
All right. Hang out just a sec.